Yep. Today's a crazy story, and I've got to change my coffee routine up. I've got to go with iced coffee today, and the only iced coffee I drink is Farmers Union. It's Farmers Union or it's nothing. So let's get into this one. In the early 90s, the internet was really the Wild West. It wasn't uncommon to see unspeakable acts of prawn in pop-up ads while you were browsing. The things that would see users today be raided by the FBI, having their hard drives confiscated and them ending up on a register so they're not putting vulnerable people at risk. It was really that bad. And the internet could really cater to those with extreme leanings. And in 1994, a website was created by a user called Perro Loco, which in English translates to Mad Dog. And the website was dedicated to the fantasy of cannibalism. The website had everything from mock artwork to recipes to fantasy role-playing requests. The Cannibal Cafe enabled its users to indulge in the extreme fetish under a number of guidelines. One was anonymity, so using an account under a pseudonym and not your real name was really encouraged. That way there would be no real-world consequences for the users if there was like a data breach. Two was consent and mutual agreement, so all participants had to agree to engage in this online fantasy world. And that was really there to just make sure that nobody's boundaries were being infringed upon. So someone could start a thread on this website and it would go something like this. The title might be meeting a homeless man at the pub and bringing him home for dinner. Inside it might say something like this. On my way home from a night out, I encountered a homeless man. The shaggy looking 50-something-year-old man asked me if I had any change, to which I told him I unfortunately didn't. But I would tell the man that I only live just there, so if you accompany me inside, I will get you some spare change. Another user might write, I am the live-in boyfriend and I hear his keys jangling the door. And the role-playing scenario stuff would essentially go from there. Another strictly enforced rule of the website was that you weren't allowed to shame other people for their kinks and fetishes. And this was really to ensure that no users were being humiliated on their platform. It really encourages the users to participate in the threads. And the third rule on the site, and most importantly, is that all fantasies and roleplay scenarios had to remain on the platform. You weren't allowed to go real world with this stuff. And given that they were fantasies and role-playing scenarios, it wasn't uncommon to see a somewhat ad being posted on the site, but usually it was looking for like people who wanted to join them for dinner as they dined out on a complete stranger or somebody that they knew that they didn't like. But it would be in early 2001 when a user named Frankie would post an ad on the site. And this thread gained significant attention. The idea that the poster was posting about was very appealing to this small group of fetish people. It met the site's obligations of consent and revealed members who fantasized of themselves being cannibalized. But as the role-playing fantasy started playing out within the community, people quickly realized that the original poster, the OP, Frankie, he wanted to take this real world. So a lot of people started to dip at that point. But one user remained, Cater99. But to understand where this is going, you need to understand what came before. Armin Meiwes was born December 1st, 1961 in Germany. And his childhood was a difficult one. He never knew his biological father, and his mother Waltrud would meet another man named Gustav and they'd have several more children. But by the time Armin was 8 years old, his mother and stepfather would be separated and Gustav would take his two boys with him and he would break all contact with Armin and his mother. Armin's mother was a very domineering and controlling woman. She would often humiliate young Armin in front of people. And given the fact that he felt so isolated and neglected, he retreated into his childhood fantasy novels. And his favourite book as a kid was Hansel and Gretel. In another part of Germany, a boy 3 years older than Armin is growing up in a similar but more tragic set of circumstances. His name is Bertrand Brands, and he's being raised by his father. You see, in 1963, his mother passed away in a car accident when he was just 5 years old. Both of his parents were doctors, and it was believed that his mother's car accident was an intentional unaliving. You see, she had fallen into a deep depression after one of her patients had passed away due to what she believed was her negligence. Bernard's father would go on to marry another woman that he worked with, and they would have more children. And this would only increase the emotional divide between Bernard and his father. His dad would mostly leave him to be raised by au pairs, which are live-in nannies, and that only aided in the feelings that Bernard had of intense abandonment. And this would only increase over time. By 1980, a 19-year-old Armin and his mother would move to a mansion that they inherited from the rest of their family. It was one of those big 44-room barn-style farmhouses. And it's while here that even though Armin is now an adult, his mother's controlling behaviour only increases, and it got to the point where Armin would go out on dates with a young woman and his mother would accompany them, and she'd even be putting him down in front of this young lady that he'd scored a date with. Now, Bernard, on the other hand, again, he's a little bit older, he is excelling academically, and he goes to university and becomes an electrical engineer. And by 1992, he starts working in an executive position for the company Siemens, which is one of the largest, and still is one of the largest manufacturing companies in the world. They're like a tech powerhouse. But Bernard's home life at this time wasn't as prosperous. His relationship with his father is very rocky. And although he had been with the same woman since 1987 and they would get engaged, by 1994 they would eventually split up due to infidelity. You see, Bernard had been caught sleeping with another man while he was on a business trip. And given the circumstances surrounding he and his fiance's separation, he was forced to come out as being openly gay. And this didn't go down too well with his father, who broke all contact with him right then and there. So it's from here that Bernard is spiraling deeper and deeper into depravity. He's often hiring male sex workers and he's asking them to indulge in this role play fantasy that is pretty disturbing. In one notorious incident, a Tanzanian sex worker hired by Bernard would later tell the police that Bernard asked him to cut off his penis, cook it, and feed it to him. It was here the male sex worker declined and said, I'm getting out of here, and he fled the hotel room. On the other side of Germany, Armin is falling deeper and deeper into this online fantasy world because by this stage, a website had started on the internet called Cannibal Cafe. And again, his favorite childhood book is Hansel and Gretel, which is at the core, I guess, eating children. So this website is like super, super enticing for him. And it's around this time that Bernard himself finds himself on the same website. Now, both men being on this Cannibal Cafe website have very different desires. Armin, having been controlled by his mother his entire life, was looking to really hold power over somebody else, while Bernard, having been neglected and abandoned by his father, wanted to be dominated. So it's like this dominatrix submissive sort of thing, I guess. Now, by 1999, Armin's mother would pass away, and he would go from an infrequent user of Cannibal Cafe to a very, very staunch, I'm on there every day for hours at a time type user. And Armin secretly desired to do this for real. He didn't just want to play out these silly little fantasies and role playing. He wanted to do this for real. He wanted to eat somebody for real. Now, during Armin's childhood, he was largely a loner and he was ostracized by other kids. So he developed this imaginary friend that he called Frankie. And Frankie, he would divulge his deepest desires, his fantasies, and sort of what he wanted to do in his life. He would tell Frankie all of this. Now, again, you got to remember Frankie isn't real. So in early 2001, a user named Frankie posts an advertisement looking for somebody who was willing to be slaughtered and consumed. Bernard would see this and under the username Katar99 would respond, just like many people responded to it. And this would take place on March 6th. So Bernard and Armin on March 6, 2001 are starting to communicate back and forth with one another. Now, although Bernard is much older than what Armin was looking for, because you got to remember he wanted someone between the ages of 18 and 30. Bernard was 43. Armin still indulged in this fantasy of potentially meeting up with Bernard. I guess there really isn't that many people who want to be, slaughtered and consumed in real life. So only 3 days after meeting online, they arranged to meet in real life. Now, Armin lived in a small village just outside of the German city of Rotenburg. Bernard would travel by train to a place called Kassel, where Armin would meet him and he would drive him out to his large mansion in basically the middle of nowhere. And Bernard came prepared. He had sleeping pills, cough syrup, and he brought a bottle of alcohol with him. Now, on the drive out there, the pair are discussing what is going to go down when they get there. And Bernard is like fully on board. I mean, he even purchased a one-way ticket. He doesn't intend on ever going back home at this point. So once they get to Armin's house, Armin goes and grabs a video camera. And it's with this video camera, Armin uses it to video record Bernard giving consent to everything that is going to take place this night. And I guess in Armin's mind, he feels like maybe this is some sort of legal protection. He can show this to the cops if he ever gets caught and says, hey, he agreed to it, so, And this videotape is reportedly over 2 hours long, and it even films what is about to go down. It even has all of that. So by this stage, Bernard is feeling the effects of the handful of sleeping tablets he took, the cough syrup, and the alcohol. He's using these vices, I guess, to numb himself. It's in the kitchen where Bernard is naked. Armin drops to his knees and attempts to bite off his penis, but he fails to do so because it's pretty tough. So undeterred, Armin stands up, goes over to a kitchen drawer, pulls it out, and grabs a large butcher's knife. It's with this knife that he severs Bernard's penis. Now at this point, and it's on camera, Bernard is screaming in pain and he slumps back in his chair, and it takes him a few minutes to compose himself, but he still wants to go ahead with this. And he even turns to Armin and says, I want to bite my own penis. I want to taste it. Armin hands it to him, but it's just way too tough. It's way too chewy. He can't even bite any of it off. So Armin comes up with this brilliant idea. He walks over to the stove and he turns it on and he heats up a pan. He gets a lump of butter and he starts chopping up some garlic. And now Bernard's butter garlic penis, I guess, is on the menu. Now, after it's cooked, the pair sit down with a bottle of wine and they try to enjoy this butter garlic penis of Bernard's, but they find that it is just way too chewy, it is way too tough, and they can't even eat it, they can't even swallow it, so they just have to push that to one side, and that little plan is out the window. Now, Bernard at this point is losing a lot of blood and he's becoming weaker and weaker, so Armin says, would you like me to run you a nice warm bath and you can get in there? And Bernard is like, sure, I think that's a great idea. So it's in the bathtub where Bernard tells Armin, he says, I'd like to be alone with my thoughts in my final moments on this earth. And Armin's like, sure. And he leaves the bathroom. And this is where Bernard is going to spend his final moments just in his own thoughts, just thinking about his life, I guess, and what brought him here. I would hope he's thinking, I don't know. But after several hours, Bernard is just drifting in and out of consciousness. He's not bleeding to death quick enough. He's in and out of consciousness and he's still alive. And at one point, he even tries to get out of the bathtub because he's planning on going to one of the bedrooms, but he doesn't have enough energy and he just falls on the tiled floor. And outside, Armin hears the thud and goes in. Armin picks up Bernard and puts him back in the bathtub, and they have a conversation about whether or not Bernard is ready to die, because clearly this bleeding out through the wound where his penis was is not killing him fast enough. Now Bernard, and again, this is on camera, he says, yes, I am ready to die. And Armin kisses him on the lips, and then he pulls out his big knife and he stabs him in the neck, and Bernard is dead within seconds. It would be over the next several days when Armin would drain all of Bernard's blood and he would start cutting bits off him. He would at one point get Bernard into the kitchen and hang him from meat hooks from the ceiling, and he'd be chopping off the meat in the kitchen. Now, just like Bernard, Armin had pre-planned this night as well, and he had created a false bottom in his freezer where he was wrapping up the meat that he'd taken off Armin's body, and he was storing it for later consumption. A year and a half would go by with nobody being the wiser as to the horrific events that took place in Armin Meiwes' mansion. Bernard himself had gone to great lengths to cover his tracks. Before meeting Armin, he had actually resigned from his executive position at Siemens, and he'd told his work colleagues that he was going to go travel to, I guess, find himself again. And due to the fact that he didn't really have family or a partner at home, nobody was really looking for him. But that was until months and months and months later, when his work colleagues would get suspicious because he hadn't returned. So they actually filed a missing persons report with the local police, but it wasn't anything urgent because Bernard was known for going away on business trips. It would be an anonymous user on the Cannibal Cafe website who would start sounding the alarm bells. Armin had returned to the website and for the past few weeks was talking about the events that took place on that night. And he was going into disturbing details, and most of the people on there, you got to remember it's a fantasy role-playing website, so most of the people on there just thought, oh, this is a fantasy, but some of them just found the details of what had happened just too authentic. And given Armin's history on the website, it was he'd been looking for somebody to meet up with in person for a while, so maybe this is real. So one anonymous user would actually go to the police and say, I think you need to investigate this. This sounds a little too real to me. And police would do just that. They would actually track the IP address of the user Frankie to Armin Meiwes' 44-room mansion. It's now December 2022 and police raid his home. It's inside where they find the videotape of the incident, and they find the false bottom in his freezer and this weird looking meat. It would be DNA tests that would prove that that weird looking meat that they found in the bottom of that freezer was Bernard Brand's, and Armin would be arrested and charged with manslaughter. The reason he was charged with manslaughter and not murder initially is because they did have the videotapes of Bernard consenting to this, and they really didn't know how the jury was going to sort of perceive all of this evidence. And due to double jeopardy laws, they weren't going to take the risk of filing murder charges and having him found innocent. And the evidence that they had was super strong against Armin. They had the written plans, the chat logs from the computer that he used. They had pretty much everything from Cannibal Cafe that Armin and Bernard had been sort of doing on there. And it really fell into a legal no man's land of consent, morality, and criminal responsibility. So one's right to die assisted unaliving, I guess, which is a grey area in Germany's legal system. It's not actually a crime. But nonetheless, Armin would confess straight away, and he would tell the cops, he would say, I didn't kill out of pleasure or desire. I killed because I wanted to be more connected to Bernard. But nevertheless, by January of 2004, Armin was found guilty of manslaughter. He would be sentenced to just 8 years in prison. Now, the general public had found out about this and they were outraged, obviously, because this is you've murdered someone you met on the internet. Okay, he did consent to it, but then you eat him? So prosecutors are nah, we got to retrial this, and we're going to retrial it as a murder charge now. And Armin Meiwes would be found guilty of that as well, but this time he would be sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Because imagine getting 8 years for that. That's crazy. And as for the website Cannibal Cafe, after it sort of came to light that this is where this all went down, the public outrage and the pressure from the authorities, the website was eventually shut down in 2003. However, the site's creator, Pero Loco, would allegedly go on to create more sites, but they never reached the same heights or notoriety as what they did prior to the Meiwes case. I guess people that were going on there realized that, hey, for some people, this just ain't a fantasy. But that effectively brings an end to the story of one of the darkest corners of the internet to have ever existed. And closing the chapter of Bernard Brands, may he rest in peace, and as always, stay safe out there in internet land.